In this first video of Abandoned House Workflow tutorial series, we're going to focus on BSP blacken of this abandoned house. This is what we're going to end up with by using BSP brushes and constructing this environment. This video is a process workflow, so everything has been sped up so you get to see the construction from beginning to end. Let's begin. Anytime you have an idea for an environment or a map you want to do, you need to spend some time in pre-production stage. This is where you collect reference and study your location so you know exactly what you want to create. And that is where I started. I had an idea that I wanted to do this abandoned house for a very long time. I took these pictures on a road trip I took, and if you've been following my blog, you've probably seen these pictures pop up. So I finally decided that this is something I need to create. And I had good reference from the front and from the side of the house. That gives me a lot of information that I can work with. Now I don't have the views from the other side or the back of the house. So those two places I would need to improvise and just create those areas myself. So in the end, there are really two ways to use reference. You can use it to recreate exactly what you see in the reference, or you can use it as a starting point and as an inspiration, and then you create the environment or the location that resembles the reference. After you've collected reference and studied your location, you should create a top-down view of your environment. If it's a playable map, the layout becomes even more important. But in this particular situation, this is a standalone game environment without any gameplay, but I still went ahead and created a top-down view of the house. This helped me to understand the overall structure of the environment, and I went a little step further and created another layout for when I expand beyond the house boundaries. So again, this was very simple and helped me to understand the spatial relationship of the environment. And at this point, I am ready to begin creating and blackening using BSP brushes inside the level editor. In my case, I am using Counter-Strike Go version of Hammer Source. I start a new map and I save that map right away in a new folder, so I maintain all of the map versions in one directory location. Now I go look for developer textures in the texture browser and start off with a ground plane. I make the ground plane very large so I can fit the house on top, and this just helps me to establish a working area. I then insert a player start right onto the ground plane, and this helps me to judge scale and proportion of the environment. I now begin to look over my reference and establish what area I'm going to start with, and it's going to be the front of the house with the first floor. Now I've edited this video to where you don't see this reference pop up anymore, but when I was recording this, I constantly jumped over and looked at the reference. And now that I've established the ground plane, the player start for scale and proportion, and where I'm going to start, it's time to get to work and begin blackening. Now, as I've mentioned, it's good to pick one area where you're going to start so you can start building from it. So in our case, I chose the front of the house, first floor, with a wall and a window. And this first area is very important to get right. You have to get the right proportion and the right scale, because we will reference and use this area to build out the rest of the house. So the height, the depth, the size of the window have to be correct. And if this section is off, then the rest of the house is going to look off too. So when you start with a section or an area, make sure you get those proportions correct. And there's a set of proportion that you should use to construct average size walls, doors, windows, and stairs. And in Hammer Source, a good height for a residential house is 128 units. And that's where I started with the first floor. I establish the height, the depth, get the window looking correct, and I am constantly judging back and forth between the reference, what it looks like inside the editor, and next to the player start. So it's extremely important that you spend as much time needed to get the initial proportion correct before you move on to duplicating any BSP brushes to the rest of the environment. And once I get the first initial proportion and scale right, the the rest of the construction becomes fairly simple, and it's a matter of selecting BSP brushes and duplicating them for the rest of the house. So at this point, I have established the window and the wall height for the first floor and for the second floor. And there's a slight variation between window size from the first to the second. But once you've established the correct proportion for just a few sections, then the duplication process becomes very easy. Now that I have a part of the environment blocked in, I need to jump inside the game and take a look at, from the point of view of the player, to judge correct proportion and scale. So I create a skybox by taking a large BSP brush, surrounding the entire level, and then hollowing it out. This isn't the proper way to create a skybox, but I just need something very quick so I can jump inside the game and test. I then insert environment cube map and a light environment entity to light this map. I also quickly go to perspective viewport and change to 3D shaded texture polygons. This helps me to see the BSP brushes a lot better. For light environment entity, I go ahead and use recommended and established values from some of the official maps in Counter-Strike. If you Google search CSGO Skylist, Valve provides you with a set of values that you can just plug in into the light environment and make the maps light like they do in some of the official maps in the game. So as a quick test, I use the Inferno lighting and copy and paste pitch, yaw and roll, pitch, brightness, and ambient colors, and just plug them in from the website into the light environment entity values. Then I click apply, compile, and jump inside the game to test. And jumping inside the game, seeing it from the point of view of the player, this is probably the most important thing you can do for your environment or your map, because it could look one way inside the editor, but everything changes once you begin to run around and see your location in real time. So we'll be doing this throughout the entire process. So by this point, everything is beginning to look good. Everything is proportionally correct and to proper scale. I judged the house for the first and the second floor. I walked around in game. I judge distances, room sizes, window sizes, wall heights, and I'm fairly happy with where it's at right now. And at this point, everything is now set. And for the rest of the process, it's just a matter of duplicating BSP brushes to build the rest of the house. Here I begin to blacken the doorway, and instead of trying to size in the BSP brushes for average door height, I went ahead and inserted a prop static and used one of the available doors that comes with Counter-Strike Go. This will establish the width and the height for the doorway. So now I would just have to resize the BSP brushes to match the prop static. And you could do the same thing for the windows. If you find the right window you wanted to use, you would have to match the BSP brush to surround and enclose that prop static. For the windows, we do something a little different, and we'll cover that later in the video. The most important part at this stage, right now, after you've established your correct proportion and scale, is to pay attention to your reference and construct your location, your environment, to match your photo reference. And you're not seeing it here, but I am constantly looking over at the reference that you saw in the beginning of the video. So at this early stage of the blackening process, I am still trying to establish the layout of the house. I'm still judging the distances that I see in the photo reference and trying to mimic that in the BSP geometry. Also, I am now reaching the back area where I don't have the reference for. So the other side of the house and the back of the house is something that I will need to create without reference. And this is usually not an issue, especially if you spend some time planning your project, looking for reference, studying your environment, creating the layout, and figuring everything out how your environment is going to look, play, and function before jumping inside the editor. So in your mind, you should already know exactly how this environment is going to look before you create anything in-game. Now with the layout done, I compile again and jump inside the map. I need to run around and take a look at the structure in the back and see if I'm happy with the layout. And overall, I like where it's going, and this is the layout of the house I'm gonna go with. Now I need to jump back in the editor. I need to begin refining the layout. So I have the structural layout down, but now I come in and begin to insert windows in the back, adjusting some of the window sizes to vary the dimensions and making it look a little bit different. I'm also looking at the reference, and in the reference there are a couple of windows that are very small and square. I have also added a door to the side and the back of the house, so I need to adjust the heights, and I decided to use a different prop static for the side door, so I quickly changed that model to something else while still adjusting some of the walls to fit around the door. So even though I have the layout down, I still need to readjust some of the BSP brushes and making them match to the windows and the doors. And you'll be doing this a lot, especially in the beginning stages of BSP blacken, which often takes the longest amount of time due to how much of adjustment and testing you constantly have to do to get the dimensions, the size, and the architecture of each element correct. Although detailing also takes up a lot of time. And that's something we are going to do later, but no amount of detailing can save your environment unless you get the foundation and the initial layout correct. So even though this may look very basic, it is extremely important that you get the structure just right. Now I begin to resize the ground floor and build up the infrastructure, the base onto which the house stands on. For this, I duplicate the ground floor and resize each brush to match the layout and the structure of the house. And then I move the ground plane further down so the base is placed on top of the ground plane. At this point, I have a lot of work already done, so I went ahead and saved a new version of the map. And I'll keep doing this, saving a new version of the map throughout the entire video. This allows me to have iterations of the map file just in case if anything goes wrong, the file gets corrupted, or I mess anything up and I want to revert back to a previous version. I now move on to the roof. I establish a base, a ceiling for the house by duplicating the foundation, the base of the house, and moving it to the top. Then by closely paying attention to the reference, I begin to block in the shape of the roof. There are a few shapes that I need to maintain, and to shape the roof to have slanted geometry, I use the vertex tool. If you select the BSP brush and then press Shift V, it'll switch over to the vertex tool, and then you can begin to manipulate vertices of that BSP brush. If you hit Shift V a couple of times, it'll cycle through different variations of the vertex tool, and I use the simplest one where you do not see the yellow vertices and all you see are the brush vertices within each corner. Then I begin to select vertices and move them to modify the BSP brush shape. Now in order to finalize the shape that you like, you need to switch over to Selection tool or Shift S, and then you'll get to see your shape completed. So my goal with the roof is the same as with the structure of the house. Right now I'm trying to block in the shape and see what it looks like very rough without any detail. So I didn't spend any time trying to refine the roof shape. I'm also not spending any time refining the structure and the layout of the house. I just want to get those big major shapes in so it looks correct, so it looks right. And if I'm happy with the overall layout and the overall shape, and only then do I continue to move on to refine those shapes. So after taking a look at how the roof looks in game, I'm happy with where it's at. I come back into the editor and now I begin to refine. So this process is now beginning to take a little bit longer than just simply blackening in BSP brushes. Now I'm beginning to enter the refinement brush stage. This is where I take those big shapes and begin to refine them. Now the important part is you begin to enter the modification and refinement BSP brush shape stage only when you have the layout and the structure correct. So I'm going through and begin to create the peaks for the rooftop. Again, I am using the vertex tool. I select the BSP brush, hit Shift V to enter vertex tool, and now I begin to overlap the top peaks of the roof to merge the vertices. I now quickly compile and jump inside the game to test. After I get a certain section done, I constantly jump inside the game and take a look at, from the point of view of the player, how the environment looks. This allows me to catch any errors or any mistakes and correct them before it gets out of control, to where I would have to go back and spend time trying to fix it. After I modified the roof shape and created a bit more geometry and detail to it, I now switch over and begin to blacken the overhang on the porch. And I'm using the same method and the same technique that we used for the structure of the house and the roof. And it's using basic rough shapes and blackening the overhang above the porch. And I know I am repeating myself here, but this is very important to understand, and you should take a very similar approach to your own work, where you are focused on using rough and simple geometric shapes to get the right layout, dimension, scale, and the overall structure of your environment. And only then do you come in and begin to detail and refine those shapes. So once I've blocked in the overhang, I have the major structure of the house down. And now I begin to focus on the windows. So at first I thought maybe I should use a prop static. So I look into what prop statics are available for different windows in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and a few windows popped up. I placed them into the map, but I did not like how they looked, and I decided that instead of using a prop static that comes with Counter-Strike Global Offensive, I would use BSP brushes and construct my own window. So you will end up having a choice when you begin to add major structural detail, such as windows, doors, and variety of other architecture elements. Most of the time you will be using props that are provided with the game. These are props that come with Counter-Strike Global Offensive or the version of the source engine you're using, and there are a lot of props that you can use. These are models created in 3ds Max, Maya, or other similar 3D software, and then imported into the game engine. But sometimes you're not going to find exactly what you're looking for. So your other option is to create your own custom props. This does require a lot more work outside of creating your map inside the editor. You actually have to model the object, texture it, export it, and then import it into source engine. And that does require knowledge and more time. So the third option, and the one that I chose, is to use BSP brushes and construct those details yourself. This may not be as good as a 3D model, but with some time does create good results. So here I am creating a window. I am constructing the glass and the frame within the wall. And probably the most important part when you're using BSP brushes to create very tiny detail is to select all those BSP brushes and tie them to a function detail entity. So once I've created the window, I select all the window BSP brushes, press Ctrl T, tie to entity, and use the drop down menu to select function detail. Once I created a single window, I go ahead and jump over to begin and refine the shape of the overhang. I use the vertex tool and begin to reposition and move the vertices around to get the better shape of each brush to match the photo reference. I use an arc tool for BSP brush to create rounded geometry for the corner of the overhang, and then I manipulate the vertices to position and merge them into a corner. Then I go around and modify the rest of the vertices for the overhang BSP geometry to match the photo reference. To help you break down the environments you create, it's helpful to start with the most important shape that helps to form your structure. So you have your primary and secondary elements. The primary element here is the layout of the house, the walls. Without the walls, we wouldn't have a layout, because now we are matching everything we create to the walls of the house. The secondary elements are overhang, roof, and porch. And these can only be created because we already have the major structure down. So now I continue to modify and shape the overhang. I duplicate brushes, switch over to vertex tool, and shape to position the overhang. Once I've blocked in the overhang, I move on to the porch. I also at this point begin to utilize visibility groups. This is where I place a set of BSP brushes and entities and then hide them from view, so I can focus on working on specific sections in the editor without having everything else in view. And right now, as I'm blocking in the porch, I'm using the overhang as a reference to see how much I need to extend the porch. So even at this point, I am constantly referencing the environment, the layout, and the rest of the geometry to continue building out and adding all the secondary detail to the house. Now once I have the porch, for the front of the house, I begin to extend to the side as well as adding stairs. To speed up your BSP blocking workflow, you may notice that I am not using the block tool, but I'm taking existing BSP brushes and duplicating them, then resizing them to fit a certain section. So if you select a brush, hold down Shift, left click, hold and drag. This will duplicate the brush, and then you can move it, resize it, and position it in a new section. And that's pretty much the workflow I use for 90% of this house construction. I now move on and begin to add a bit of detail to under the overhang. This is going to be support for the columns. So here I do use the block tool for unique shapes, such as a BSP arc or cylinder, and I needed to recreate that arc for the underside of the overhang. Now that I have the overhang and the porch blocked in, I need to compile and test to run around the map and take a look at the dimensions, the scale, the size, and how it looks in game. And so far, I like how it looks. It has the right dimensions and the proportions that I want. And once you're happy with the general blocked in shape, only then do you go in and begin to refine those shapes. So at this point, I like the scale and the size of the overhang and the porch. So now I can come back in and begin to add more detail, such as the columns, which will support the overhang. Also, those BSP brushes that I added for the underside of the overhang now come in handy because that's where the columns are going to be attached to, and that's the support that I wanted. And I got those details by paying close attention to the reference. And I'm going to mention the importance of your reference again, that you study your reference and create all of your details from what you see in the photo reference. For the columns, I used the BSP tool and I changed the object type to cylinder with 12 sides. Then I created a bottom and top platform on which that cylinder stands, and then I selected all the elements of the column and the supports, and I duplicated it across for the entire porch. And now I move on to windows. I already have one window created, so I just duplicate that window, move it over, switch over to solids component mode, and modify the brushes within that window to fit the window cutout. If you remember, we selected all of the brushes for the window and turned them into a function detail. So if you select the window, all of the brushes within it will be selected. And in order for you to modify individual brushes within that selection, you can switch over to solids component mode on the right hand side panel, and it will allow you to modify brushes within that function detail without having to destroy the function detail just to modify a few brushes. So that function is very helpful. For the windows themselves, we only have 3 different variations for the house. So I only need to have 3 different window sizes, and then I would duplicate these windows for the rest of the house. Now before I go on and duplicate all of the windows for all other sections, I went ahead and compiled just so I can check on the columns, the overhang support, the stairs, the front windows, and the windows at the very top. Again, I do this because I want to make sure that what I have created so far looks good. before I continue to add any more detail or duplicate those details for the rest of the house. And based on this recent in-game test, I go back into the editor and I begin to refine and modify the overhang. I lower some of the vertices to create a bit of space between the window on the second floor. I now adjust the geometry for the support around the columns. So now I'm beginning to enter more refinement and detailing stage of the BSP. The entire structure and the layout is now done, and we will now be modifying the foundation of the house. It's now more about refining the shape and adding detail to various sections within the house. And here I am focused on duplicating the windows and positioning them around the house. I am still maintaining developer textures on all of the geometry, but since I'm duplicating the detail, it might be a good idea to begin texturing that detail and then duplicate it around the house, since later on I will have to texture each individual window separately, and it will add a little bit more time to the production, where if I were to texture them now, I would only have to do it once and then duplicate that around the environment. So you could take that approach to where you don't duplicate any detail until you get to texturing stage, then you texture that detail and duplicate it around the map. You could also texture it right away during this BSP stage, but I like to keep the process more separated. So I wanted to focus on BSP blacken and detailing stage, and once I'm happy with that, then I move on to texturing stage. So with more practice, you'll find the approach that works for you for that particular project. So your workflow will vary depending on what you are creating, how much experience you have, and what you're comfortable with. Here I compile again to run around the map in-game and take a look at the windows and any issues that I may have missed. And there's a flickering window that I pushed the geometry of the window a little bit too far into the wall, so I need to fix that. But overall, I like the progress. I jump back into the editor and duplicate some of the windows for the bottom first floor. I need to resize them, and again I am selecting that function detail, switching over to solids component mode, and modifying the BSP brushes of that window. So I am maintaining the same window design, I'm just making it smaller by reshaping the brushes. And at this point I am done with the windows. Now I jump over to the overhang for the side of the house, and I need to add a bit more detail by creating some wooden columns and wooden posts that I see in the reference. These are wooden beams that go from the ground up to the top of the overhang, and I create one and then I duplicate that and reposition some of the wooden beams. I also add a couple more beams and create a slight angle for a bit of variety. And again, I'm looking at the reference and that's what I see in the reference as I'm creating these wooden beams. I am also maintaining the same workflow as I've been doing throughout this entire video. First, I am blackening the position and the general location of these wooden beams. And then when I'm happy with how they look, I would go back in and go through what I call an imperfection pass, where I just change some of the shapes and create more angles to make them look more realistic, so they're not straight and aligned, because nothing in real life is perfectly placed, especially for an abandoned house. So you would see a lot of decay, a lot of imperfections in the house, but I would only go through that pass after I have the general position and the shape of the wooden beams. And again, anytime you create any detail using BSP brushes, you should select that BSP detail, press Ctrl T, and choose function detail to help you optimize your environment. Because Hammer Source does not like when you have BSP brushes to be used for detail, and it's recommended that you turn those BSP brushes to function detail entity. And here I jumped inside the compiled map again to take a look at the detail that I've done so far for the windows on the bottom and for the wooden beams underneath the overhang. And now back in the editor, I switch my focus to the roof. to begin to refine and add detail to the roof. You may have noticed that I tend to jump around from one section of the environment to another. So I worked on the porch, then I moved on to the overhang, then I worked on the side of the house for the wooden beams, and now I'm going back to the roof. And the reason I'm doing that is because I like to bring up everything to the same amount of detail across the entire environment. So I avoid working on one section of the map in isolation. I like to bring everything up together, so no one section within this map has more detail than another. Now, a very important part about detailing is you only want to detail and focus on areas within the map where the player is going to be in. So for example, if I were creating a playable map with this house, but the back of the house will never have a player actually see it, then I wouldn't focus adding any detail to the back. So be very aware of what you're creating this environment for and what the player can see. This will determine how much detail you add and where you focus your time on. So for the roof, I've created a bit of border and an overhang for the front, sides, and the back of the roof. I've also redid and reestablished the base for the roof, which helps to add more thickness to the bottom. Now I'm creating an attic window using a different texture so I can see it better. And then I duplicate that window and position it around the house. And I compile and jump inside the map. I'm taking a look from the point of view of the player and looking up to see how the roof looks and how that new window detail looks. And again, I'm not going all the way up to see it up close. I'm only focused where I can see it from the player's point of view. So as I'm walking around and looking at the house at the state that it's in now, I am taking mental notes of what I need to change when I go back into the editor. So jumping back into Hammer Source, I'm now changing some of the shapes of the roof, and I'm actually going against reference. In the photo reference, the shape of the roof is a little bit different, but when I created that slant, I did not like how it looked. The shape of the roof resembled more European style, and while testing in-game, I did not like the shape. So yes, you want to pay close attention to the reference, but at the same time, your final outcome is how the player sees it, and if it doesn't look good in-game, then you want to change it until it does, until it makes sense to the player. And the player is the most important person that you are designing the environment for. So I went ahead and adjusted the shape of the roof, and now I'm going around, duplicating the attic windows, and finalizing the final roof shape. And with the roof shape completed, and the window detail added and duplicated, I compile once again, and test to see what it looks like. I like the roof shape now a lot better. Also, the roof contains overlapping BSP brushes. And ideally, you do not want to have any BSP brushes that are overlapping at all. But the roof part contains slanted angles, so it's a little bit harder to align everything. So what I'm going to do is turn the entire roof into function detail. And there's a thick sealing brush that separates the roof and the house. So I'm going to leave that as a BSP brush. So roof becomes function detail, and the overlapping BSP brushes are no longer a problem. But yes, ideally you do not want to have any BSP brushes that are overlapping, which makes it very difficult for Source Compiler to optimize your map. So you want to make sure that everything is aligned and on the grid. And for those very complex BSP brushes, just turn them into a function detail. I also began to add various sections of the house onto their own vis groups. This allows me to turn on and off the visibility of them so they don't clutter the viewport. Since we have a lot of BSP brushes now, such as for the windows, overhang, and the roof, it becomes very difficult to work on detailing and to select BSP brushes. But by placing them onto a vis group and then turning it off, they disappear from view, so you can focus on specific sections and see them better. So here I began to add more detail for the side overhangs wooden beams. So I am modifying and reshaping to add more angles and reposition some of the geometry. And for that I am using vertex tool, and I'm just modifying a set of vertices such as the top or the bottom to create those angles. And after I did a brief imperfection pass, I jump into the game and take a look at how everything looks. So I come back in and continue. By now I think you are beginning to see the entire workflow. We started off with big major shapes that define the structure of the environment. Then we moved on to secondary shapes, the overhang, the porch, the roof, and then we began to add major detail such as the windows, doors, the columns, the wooden beams underneath the overhang that we are working on now. And another major detail we're going to add is a border brush between the first and the second floor and around the corners of the house. So we're going to have this border on each corner and going around the entire house. So I duplicate a small brush, position it in the corner, size it, align it, and when I'm happy with the positioning, I begin to duplicate. And I do this for the border on each corner and for the border that goes around the house. Now when it comes to detailing, I usually separate this process into major detailing that we worked on so far and minor detailing, which we are going to focus on in a later video. And the way to separate major and minor detail is to think of bigger and smaller shapes. So the major detail we worked on so far included columns, wooden beams, borders around the house that we're working on now, and minor detail would be even smaller shapes and refinement of existing shapes. And major and minor detail will vary based on the environment you are trying to create. But when you see the detail in video, it will begin to come together more clearly. Also, the reason that I do minor detail later and not in a BSP blacken stage with the developer textures is because texturing itself will often add its own detail, which will help me to determine if I need to add any additional detail with BSP brushes or props. So after I am done duplicating the border around the house for the corner and for the halfway around the house, I compile and jump inside the map. Just as before, I am paying attention to everything I've changed so far and to see how it looks. If I've overlapped any BSP brushes, if I missed anything, and I'm just taking a look from a point of view of the player and noticing if I need to change anything. I will also end up turning all this detail into function detail. So they're not small BSP brushes, but they are treated as an entity and not counted as BSP, which is very important for optimization and to speed up your compiling. I come back into the editor and refine the stair shape. Although in a detailing video, I completely rework and redo the stairs. For the last part of this video, I go inside the house and I create the second floor. So I take the bottom base, the foundation, and I duplicate that brush to be used for the second floor. Now it's important to note that I will not be creating interior of this house, so the player will not be able to enter inside, but the layout does allow for this interior to be usable. So since the interior is not going to be playable, I still am going to create the layout, the walls and the doorways for the first and the second floor, just in case if the player happens to look inside through a window. I want to create the illusion that there is an interior which will create more believable environment, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the inside or attempt to add a lot of detail. So I'm quickly going through adding walls and doorways to establish the boundaries of different rooms. I'm doing this for the second floor, and then I move down to add the same thing for the first floor. And I am being very aware of what kind of rooms there would be on the second floor, which would mostly be bedrooms. And on the first floor, we would have a kitchen, a dining room, a living room, and probably some kind of a pantry that would be used for storage. So I am thinking about the functionality of this space, and I'm not adding these walls and doors randomly. And with this interior, this is the last part of the BSP blacken. I finish off by adding different sections of this house to various vis groups to maintain better organization. Then I need to compile to check the work and make sure that everything is looking good, to make sure that there are no geometry that I missed, that everything is consistent, that there are no noticeable problems or errors, and to see if I'm ready to move on to the texturing phase. And in the next second video of this workflow, we're going to focus on texturing this environment.